In this episode, we talk about athletes from Pakistan being allowed to participate in international sporting events hosted by India. We also talk about the conflict in Myanmar that has led to over 4,000 refugees crossing over to Mizoram. But we begin by talking about the debate around the use of secular and socialist in the preamble. Hi, I am Niharika Nanda, and you are listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. Last month, around the time the emergency marked its 50th anniversary, several key leaders, including Vice President Jagdeep Dhankar, reignited an old debate. RSS General Secretary Dattatreya Hosable, Union Minister Shivraj Singh Chauhan, and Assam Chief Minister Himanta Biswa Sharma all questioned the inclusion of secular and socialist in the preamble of the Constitution, an addition made during the Indira Gandhi-led emergency. So to understand why these two words were added and what difference it would make if they were removed, my colleague Shashank Bhargava spoke to the Indian Express's national legal editor, Apurva Vishwanath.
Apurva, the emergency has been one of the darkest periods in modern Indian history. It was the time we saw democracy being pushed to the brink. And yet what we're talking about is the inclusion of these two words, secular and socialist, which don't really have anything to do with authoritarianism. Does this incongruity come to your mind as well?
Yeah, so this debate seems to reflect the politics of today rather than the politics of the emergency, really.
Right, and tell us, what was the context under which these two words were added to the preamble?
So in 1976, you have to imagine a very, very different political climate that was prevailing at that time. When we talk about socialism, it was one of the key planks on which Indira Gandhi's politics stood. There was a slogan of Garibi Hatao that she had given as a message to the nation. And why just Indira Gandhi? Look at the whole tussle that successive governments since independence have had with the judiciary, right? So every prime minister had a strong socialist agenda. Whether it was Nehru's land reforms or subsequently, Indira Gandhi's removal of privy purse or bank nationalization, these were all key socialist economic policies which were at odds with the Supreme Court's interpretation of the Constitution. We keep writing this in our Constitution series also, where we look at legal history and these very important cases from the 50s. A lot of these key economic ideas that the government brought in were struck down by the Supreme Court. So this whole tension between the parliament and the court is in a sense on the idea of socialism, or where the constitutional alignment is on economic rights. So in that sense, Indira Gandhi did want to send a message out, whether it is to the judiciary or to the people at large, that the constitutional alignment in India is towards socialism. That socialism is a constitutional idea, and therefore when judges interpret it, should keep that in mind. Having said that, socialism is not the same today as it could have been in the 50s or the 70s, right? That idea is also rapidly evolving. So that's where the idea at that time came in.
And what about the word secular? It's obviously very contentious now, but we understand that even the founding fathers had debated it quite a bit. But what was Indira Gandhi's rationale back then?
So again, the politics at that time, Indira Gandhi did think that there were forces, which could even be from the RSS or, many political quarters at that time where she perceived a threat to her popularity. That was a larger political idea, that by saying or reiterating that we are a secular country, it would push her political agenda.
And also talk about how exactly she was able to add these two words into the preamble.
So, the preamble is, of course, something that we're all familiar with, where before the constitutional provisions begin, there is this dedication of the Constitution by the people to the people, right? So we say that we, the people of India, having solemnly resolved to constitute India into a sovereign, democratic republic. And then, it goes on to talk about all kinds of liberties and rights that we have. And then we say, we give unto ourselves this constitution. So what Indira Gandhi did was add these phrases to describe the nature of our democratic republic. So the 42nd Amendment said that it would be that India is a sovereign, socialist, secular, democratic republic. So the addition of these two expressions to the preamble is essentially what she did. But having said that, it's not as if that if these words didn't exist, that India would cease to be a secular country or that India would cease to be a socialist country for all it was. Before 1976, also India was secular, and it continues to be so even after 1976.
And after Indira Gandhi was defeated in the 1997 elections, it was the Janata Party that came to power. And it actually undid a lot of the changes that were made under the emergency. Were there attempts to undo this?
That's very interesting because the 44th Constitution Amendment, which the Janata government brought in, extensively debated the changes that were made during the emergency. And it undid large parts of the 42nd Amendment. In the 42nd Amendment, apart from these changes to the preamble, Indira Gandhi did a whole bunch of other things, including, by the way, adding a chapter on fundamental duties. Our original constitution did not have a chapter on fundamental duties. It only spoke about rights. But Indira Gandhi sort of added a chapter on duties, in a sense reminding people that you have a duty to the nation and you don't really keep asking for your rights. For what it's worth, there were no rights during the emergency. So the focus was brought onto the duties. But these two things, however, the Janata government left untouched. So in fact, in the parliamentary debates, if you see, a lot of members do talk about it and say that, the Janata government is actually doing the right thing, that they're not just acting in vengeance and undoing everything, but are actually applying their minds to it. And the fact that we retain these words, secular and socialist, in the preamble is actually lauded by other members of the parliament.
And right now we are talking about this because several leaders have been questioning this. And we've seen this kind of debate in the past as well. So could you talk about the attempts that have been made to remove these two words and what the courts have said about it?
Look, before we get into the attempts to remove this or, what courts have said about it, there is something that is more fundamental about the Constitution. That the framers of the Constitution, while drafting it, were very conscious that this is a secular constitution. In the debates, even in areas where secularism is not in question, right? Where we are talking about minority rights, where we are talking about the nature of educational institutions, in so many other aspects, members and even those who were seemingly to the right of center, even they emphasized that we are a secular nation, right? The only reason that the framers did not explicitly add this expression into the constitution is perhaps because at that time the idea was to really separate state and church, right? Because India being such a diverse country, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, so the overlying political thought was that you needed to keep religion away from the constitution, and that is all sorts of religion. In fact, there's a very interesting debate where they talk about how, the vice president should take his oath, and there the question is, an amendment is proposed to say that the oath should be taken in the name of God, and there are members who oppose this, saying, why should it be God? We should keep God out of the constitution. And there are members who say, we are not really a godless nation. We don't have to say which God, but we should not keep God out of the constitution because that India is a deeply religious country. Eventually, in fact, Ambedkar says that he will settle for it. He says, this doesn't make India secular or not. You can say God, for all you know, but it doesn't mean that the state should have a position on these things.
And I suppose that is the reason, our idea of secularism differs so much from the Western idea of secularism. Because, for example, in the French version, it means staying away from all religions, whereas in India, it means the inclusion of all religions.
Or being equidistant from all religions. It is to ensure that you're not favoring one religion over the other religion. That is the Indian idea of secularism, which, by the way, has evolved over the years. It's not that in 1947 we came in with this imagination of how church and state should operate in India, right? It is over the years the kind of politics that we've built in this country and the protections that our constitution offers. Because you look at the chapter on fundamental rights, it talks about removal of untouchability, which is such a novel idea for 1947. This is when in the US, there was still segregation laws, right? Except for the military, segregation was constitutionally permitted in every other state in the United States at this time. And of course, you had the apartheid in South Africa. So at that time, to conceive an idea that there will be no untouchability, that there will be the right to equality and that is cutting across gender, caste, creed, race, religion, everything. These are all facets of secularism. So it's incorrect to say that the framers didn't have this in mind, but only Indira Gandhi inserted it during the emergency, right?
Yeah, that makes it seem like it was Indira Gandhi who thought that the country should be secular.
Yeah, it's funny because, if there is one thread that permeates through every provision of the constitution, it is equality. And there is no country which has an equality code like that we see in the Indian constitution.
So like you said, it's not as if, adding the word secular to the preamble made our constitution secular. So what is it that people who want this removed really want? Because even if you were to remove the word secular, that doesn't change the constitution, right?
Yeah, and there are two things here. One is whether the preamble dictates every provision of the constitution, right? So whether something is in the preamble or not doesn't really affect the operational parts of the constitution. So even say you take away equality from the preamble, does that mean you take away the right to equality in Article 14? It's not necessarily so. Or just because you add secularism to this, does it enrich Article 14? Not necessarily so, right? So how equality operates doesn't really change. Having said that, you've been hearing the BJP and the RSS for a long time now talk about minority appeasement or how successive Congress governments allegedly participated in appeasing the minority. So it is in that context that you have to read the statements about secularism. It is also in the context that because it's an amendment that is brought during the emergency, that this has to be removed. So the second argument might still have some merit in it because, in a sense, the constitutional amendments that were passed during the emergency at a time when opposition leaders were jailed, it's just in its name that this is lawful, that it has parliamentary sanction, right? Otherwise, these amendments did not have that moral authority or the just authority of why something becomes a law. Having said that, if that is the problem, then the vice president or anybody criticizing this should also have a problem with the chapter on fundamental duties. But, we've seen that since the Modi government came to power, there has in fact been a lot of renewed emphasis on duties. In fact, the government had a scheme in 2019 to spread awareness amongst fundamental duties. Former Union Law Minister Ravi Shankar Prasad has spoken about the importance of fundamental duties. So if the emergency era insertion was a problem, then maybe this needs to be revisited as well. The focus should be back on rights and not on duties of a citizen. But the words in itself, and this is something that the Supreme Court has also emphasized. Just in 2024, when Chief Justice Sanjeev Khanna was hearing a writ petition that was filed seeking the removing of these two expressions or saying that was unconstitutional, he actually said that in today's time, there is no doubt about what these two words mean. And there is no reason to remove them now, 50 years after, it's been inserted. So, yeah, of course, a nation can change its idea of socialism. What socialism was in the 50s doesn't necessarily have to be the socialism of today. But there is no doubt that India continues to be a welfare state, right? We do have socialist ideals in how we implement our economic policies. So, but if the parliament wants to debate that and discuss what kind of a nation we should be, that's absolutely, up for conversation. But just because these words were inserted in the preamble at one point of time doesn't necessarily make anything.
And it seems funny because, the word secular is not mentioned anywhere in the constitution. So it almost seems like if the word secular is removed from the preamble, then these leaders can say, show me where secularism is written in the constitution. It's not written anywhere.
Yeah. So you may Control F, the Constitution of India, PDF, and you may not find the word secular anywhere but the preamble. But there are several synonyms of secularism, or even better words that speak for secularism. Article 14, which talks about the right to equality. Article 15, which prohibits any kind of discrimination. In fact, I would argue that the negative use of words in the Constitution, right, which says that no state shall discriminate, in Article 15, that is a stronger expression of secularism than saying we are secular. It actually gives a directive to the state that you cannot put one religion over the other. So, there are stronger expressions of secularism in the Constitution.
And next, we turn to the world of sports. Following the Pahalgam terror attack in April, which claimed 26 lives, the Indian government had suspended the visas of all Pakistani nationals residing in the country and directed them to leave. In the sporting community, this raised concerns about whether athletes from across the border would be allowed to participate in international sporting events hosted by India. But last week, a sports ministry official confirmed that Pakistani athletes will in fact be allowed to compete in multi-nation tournaments being held here. Now, this is significant because India is set to host at least a dozen international competitions this year, including the Asian Championships and the Commonwealth Championships. To understand why the government has made this decision, we are joined by the co-host of the Express Sports podcast, Mihir Vasavda. Mihir, we understand that it is through official sources that you've come to know that Pakistan athletes will be allowed to take part in the multi-nation tournaments in India, though not in the bilateral ones. But does that include cricket as well?
So we're talking about close to a dozen events across 10 sports. We aren't including cricket because the Indian and Pakistani cricket boards, along with the International Cricket Council, have agreed mutually to play on neutral territories whenever there are competitions held in either of the countries. So except cricket, we are looking at, for example, the earliest competitions would be the Commonwealth Weightlifting Championships in Ahmedabad. That's in August, starts on August 24th. A few days later, on August 27 or 28, the Hockey Asia Cup starts in Bihar. And then you have an entire list of events. You have the Asian Swimming Championship once again in Ahmedabad. There is the Junior Badminton World Championship in Guwahati, the Junior Hockey World Cup in Chennai and Madurai. There are multiple athletics events, one in Bhubaneswar, one in Delhi. So there will be events there, in squash as well. So in large range of sports, there will be events being organized in India this year where we can expect Pakistani athletes to compete.
But Mihir, why has this decision been taken? Why is India allowing athletes from Pakistan to take part in tournaments being conducted in India?
So international sport is governed by what's called the Olympic Charter. Now, we're talking largely of Olympic sports, and every country, including India, is a signatory to the Olympic Charter, all the countries that are the members of the International Olympic Committee. Now, the Rule 44 of the Olympic Charter very specifically says that the country that is hosting a tournament, quote unquote, should ensure that no one has been excluded for racial, religious, or political reasons, or by reasons of other forms of discrimination. Now, this particular rule is being held in a very serious regard by the International Olympic Committee. Any violation, slightest of violations, has seen countries being punished, and India has been victim of that in the past.
And can you talk about what happened last time when India did not allow Pakistani athletes to take part in sporting events?
So this happened back in 2019 when 3 Pakistani members, one shooter and a couple of managers, they were supposed to take part in the shooting World Cup in New Delhi in February 2019. This was days after the Pulwama terror attacks, and the 2 shooters and the manager who were supposed to arrive in Delhi never came because they claimed that they never got their visas, and eventually they had to withdraw from the tournament. Now, India officially never said or gave any reasons why the Pakistanis couldn't make it, and they were the only team that couldn't make it for the tournament. But the International Shooting Federation and the Pakistani Shooting Federation, they said that visas weren't given in the aftermath of the Pulwama terror attacks. Now, in immediate reaction to that, the International Olympic Committee accused India of violating the Olympic Charter, especially the principles of non-discrimination, and they announced that it suspended all talks with India for hosting sporting events in the future, and went on to recommend to all international federations that they neither award nor hold sports events in India until they receive written assurances from the Indian government that everyone will be guaranteed entry. If I were to just expand on it, the government then gave written assurances to the Indian Olympic Association, and in very categorical terms, they did give it in writing that they would permit all qualified athletes belonging to any National Olympic Committee to take part in events that are held in India.
Right, and in such cases, like you mentioned, the International Olympic Committee basically can take away the rights from a country to host events in the future. Has the IOC taken any such action in the recent past?
Yep. Kuwait, for example, 10 years ago, they were sanctioned after they refused to grant a visa to an Israeli delegate for the Asian Shooting Championship. Malaysia, around the same time when India was sanctioned, they too were reprimanded and stripped of the hosting rights of the World Para Swimming Championships after they too denied visas to Israelis. More recently, we've seen that FIFA took away the hosting rights of the Under-20 World Cup from Indonesia. And there are many other examples like these. India, we've already mentioned. So there are instances in the past, and hence you see, like the US, for example, under President Trump, they imposed a complete travel ban on a dozen countries, but they've made specific exceptions for athletes who will participate in the 2026 FIFA World Cup and the 2028 Los Angeles Olympics. So for India, if they were to stop the Pakistani athletes from coming to the country for events, if they were not to grant them visas, it would mean that the ambitions to host the Commonwealth Games in 2030 and the Olympics in 2036 would be severely damaged.
So, Mihir, with this rule, what we are seeing is that sports becomes an exception, even when there are tensions between two countries. And come to think of it, that's not a bad thing, because it shows that sport can really bring people together. But in more serious situations like this one, where a terror attack is involved, that sentiment doesn't really seem to hold, right? At least not for many government officials. It feels more like they're simply following the IOC rules.
I mean, that's something that the government will have to officially say. I mean, as things stand right now, it looks like they are playing by the rules, because if they were doing it out of will, then I'm pretty sure that India and Pakistan would play each other more often bilaterally and not just in multi-nation tournaments. In all sports, from cricket to hockey to weightlifting and wrestling. So they seem to be playing by the rules, and you're right, because we've seen in the past that sport can bring together people, but also at the same time, the IOC members, the former president of Croatia, Kolinda Grabar-Kitarovic, she did mention that there is growing politicization of sport, and because of the conflicts we are seeing in different regions, sports becoming a victim of it. And based on that, the IOC had very clearly said that they will hold talks with the future Olympic hosts only if they uphold the Olympic Charter, and the moment there is any infringement, all stages of dialogues will be stopped. So they are pretty strict about that, and I think India, which aspires to host the 2036 Olympics and sent a delegation to Lausanne, where the IOC headquarters is based, just last week, India has taken this pretty seriously and playing by the rules.
And in the end, we talk about the developments in Myanmar. A renewed outbreak of fighting in Myanmar's Chin state over the past few days has led to around 4,000 refugees crossing into Mizoram. As reported by the Indian Express's Sukrita Barua, the clashes began on 2nd of July and involved two anti-junta forces, the Chin National Defence Force and Chinlen Defence Force, Hualnogram. According to a security official in Mizoram, the situation remains fluid. The number of arrivals could still change. Most refugees have entered the Champhai district, especially the villages of Zokavthar and Saikumphai. Many are staying with relatives on the Indian side of the border, while others have found shelter in camps run by local organizations. Barua also reports that 4 people injured in the fighting have been brought to Mizoram for treatment. 2 are being treated at the Champhai District Hospital, and 2 others have been referred to Aizawl for further care. Robert Zorem Tluaga, who heads a Champhai district community supporting Myanmar refugees, said the latest arrivals are being housed in local community spaces. He added that even before this fresh wave, the district was already hosting about 13,000 refugees from Myanmar. Barua notes that Mizoram has been home to thousands of Chin refugees since Myanmar's military coup in 2021. These refugees share ethnic ties with the Mizos in India. According to Mizoram's Home Department, before this latest escalation, the state was already sheltering an estimated 33,000 Chin refugees from Myanmar and another 2,000 from Bangladesh. You were listening to 3 Things by the Indian Express. Today's episode was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar and produced by Ichha Sharma, Shashank Bhargava and me, Niharika Nanda. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it. Share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can also tweet us at Express Podcast and write to us at podcasts@indianexpress.com.